Today we are finally taking a look at the RX 9060 XT 16GB. Now this is the Gigabyte Gaming OC, and I think the most innovative feature of this graphics card is a cover that slides open to reveal just plain RGB, or you can cover it to light up or illuminate the Gigabyte RGB logo. That's right, that's probably the most exciting thing about this graphics card, because unfortunately the value just isn't really there. And this is going to be my biggest complaint about the RX 9060 XT 16GB, just like it was with the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, and that is these 60 class cards. And before we move into the gaming benchmarks, we're actually going to pull up the value charts, because I feel like this is the most important thing if you're looking for a 60 class card. Whether it's from AMD or from Nvidia, these 60 class cards have traditionally always been about value. They've been the hardest hitting value cards out of the stack, especially in the case of Nvidia and their RTX 5060 Ti. The Ti, that was always better value than the 70 class card, and it always packed just that raw price performance. Now, when we look at the RX 9060 XT 16GB, when we compare it to either the street price or the MSRP prices provided from AMD, in either cases, when we stack that up against the benchmark numbers that we'll talk about very soon, it's worse value than the RX 9070 16GB. Now, granted, the RX 9070 is an impressive card. I was pretty impressed with that card. It's still sad to see that this 60 class card has been hollowed out essentially to the point where it feels like it's more a 50 class card or an entry level gaming graphics card, just with 16GB slapped on top of it. Let's go through those gaming benchmark numbers and then sum up with what I feel is more or less a perfect analogy to describe why I'm a bit upset with this launch this time around, right after today's video sponsor.
Do you need to get Windows 10 or Windows 11 activated and don't want to spend $200 or some other exorbitant price? Well, if so, today's video sponsor VIP SCD Keys has you covered. For as little as $15 using the coupon code BFTYC, you can get Windows 10 activated, and for a little bit more you can get Windows 11 activated too. Links in the description below to find out more.
Now let's go through these gaming benchmarks, starting off with the first game and the only victory for the 9060 XT 16GB. This is starting off with Final Fantasy 16. And here's where at 1440p we score a victory, 57 average FPS versus 56. But stepping it up to 4K, this is where the 5060 Ti then does a little bit better. So they must have that GDDR7 working a bit better on the 128-bit bus, which is something of a disappointment on both these 60 class cards this time around. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but let's go through Riftbreaker here at 1440p. The 5060 Ti does score a bit better, and then at 4K it's also a similar story. But one thing to talk about with the 60 Ti 16GB from Nvidia is it is priced significantly higher, both on the street and on its MSRP. So we will have a dedicated video on that tomorrow, but I thought I'd do a more traditional review of these gaming benchmarks and just show you all the numbers of all the cards around the field. Even the 7800 XT, which ironically can be still had for a really good price in Australia, just not in the USA. Though, moving through Marvel Rivals, here's where the 9060 XT 16GB does do pretty well, but it's still a chunk behind that of the 5060 Ti, as well as the 7800 XT. Though, moving through Space Marine 2, and here's where at 1440p and both 4K, the 9060 XT 16GB does get beaten by the 5060 Ti 16GB. Then going on to Fortnite, it's not such of a big difference. And then on to Black Myth Wukong at both 4K and 1440p high settings, 100% screen res, it does start to fall behind a little bit here too. Then when it comes to Cyberpunk, the 9060 XT is very close to that of the 5060 Ti. Though when we look at the ray tracing numbers, which will quickly pull up some benchmarks here, both with FSR and DLSS enabled versus not enabled, here is where if you're just going for raw ray tracing on ultra settings, both the 5060 Ti and the 9060 XT class cards are not really going to do this, but if when we step it down to a base resolution at 1440p and upscale it to 4K, some of these games can perform pretty well. It's just for me personally, I do have to take a side note. As someone who reviews the cards, I'm going to show you the numbers, but I always like to add a personal spin into my reviews. I've noticed with ray tracing, the tax, the FPS that you get taxed for the visual fidelity that you're getting given with ray tracing just isn't worth it. I just find myself more and more not turning on these ray tracing settings in the games that I play, whether it's a new game or an older title. I just find myself only really enabling certain upscalers, and that also depends on the game, whether it's DLSS or if it's FSR or if it's the TSR built into the game engine itself. So the ray tracing, I just thought I'd take a little sort of detour off with ray tracing, and whether or not, for me personally, as someone who plays a lot of games, I don't really find myself using ray tracing all that much. Though I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section about ray tracing. Is it something that you really focus on? But I think with the DLSS upscaling, NVIDIA definitely has that advantage with their K-update model, where that looks absolutely gorgeous and you can get actually quite a bit of performance. Ultimately, when it does come to DLSS and ray tracing, NVIDIA does hold that advantage. It's just that I'd place, actually as time goes on, I'm placing less and less weight on that actual metric when I'm looking at pure value. However, that said, let's look at some power consumption numbers here. And here's where the 9060 XT 16GB, I've actually got two models here. And tomorrow we'll be taking a look at the Steel Legend. We are using the Gigabyte OC for these benchmarks here, but ironically, these cards have the exact same 182 watt power limit, which also I measured from the wall. They were clocking in pretty much the exact same FPS and the exact same wattage numbers. So the power consumption itself was actually quite poor for the performance we were getting out of this card, especially versus the 9070, which is something we're going to talk about after we look at the card and these power consumption results here. Though, if you want to undervolt this card, here's where it does do quite well, dropping the power limit down 30%, raising the memory to 2,800 megahertz, and then putting on the fast timings, as well as about a 60 millivolt undervolt. The ASRock Steel Legend did go to around -70, so it did do a little bit better in terms of being stable in Space Marine 2, but then the Gigabyte maxed out at around -60, and the performance numbers were pretty much identical at these settings, but ultimately undervolting will give you a boost in performance, or if you want to overclock, you can go down that route too, use up a little bit more power as well as get about a 10% boost out of this card. So ultimately the stock configuration, I do recommend with the 9060 XT either overclocking or undervolting to get basically either the same FPS but way less power consumption, or get a performance boost and use a bit more power, which even with the overclock is not going to skew your power efficiency level. So you're just going to be getting extra performance and using extra power in more or less a linear fashion. Now, before we get on to a conclusion, let's take a quick look at this gaming OC from Gigabyte here, the model itself. 2-slot design, 3 smaller fans, as well as a blow-through design at the back. And you've got there at the back 2 DisplayPort 2s, as well as an HDMI 2.1 out. Now, there's some RGB on the side, which has this weird cover that you can either cover up and illuminate the Gigabyte logo, or you can then push the Gigabyte logo aside and just have some RGB there. Though out of the box, it does a really good job with the thermals, and it's pretty whisper quiet. I'll let you guys take a listen.
This is me whispering, just whispering near the phone. It's quiet.
And one thing I will note, however, the ambient temperatures where I'm at the moment are quite cool, cooler than I'm used to doing the testing on. And so I will point out those memory junction temperatures. It seems like it's, for me personally, it has been quite high on all the RX 9000 series cards I've seen come through here. So it looks like there's higher VRAM temperatures in general. And with that, I would personally recommend undervolting the card and raising the fan speeds, say in this case, to around 40%. But your VRAM temperatures, when you undervolt, there's less power draw, and so your VRAM ultimately is going to remain a lot cooler, but the whole cooler is doing the GPU core and the VRAM too. Anyhow, with all the numbers done, all the chat done about the GPU itself, it's time to look at the actual value proposition here with the 9060 XT 16GB. And here's where I'm going to say I just wanted a bit more from this lineup of card, not just from AMD, but also from NVIDIA. I thought, especially the 60 Ti class card, I thought that should have been a 192-bit bus. And then in this case, I thought the 9060 XT should have been a 192-bit bus too, where perhaps they could have used 12 gigabytes of VRAM and just beefed up the actual raw performance of the GPU core at the cost of giving us a little bit less VRAM, as I think the 8 gigabytes is too little, but I think the 16 gigabytes in this format may be a bit too much, considering when you get to that VRAM intensive situation where you need 16 gigabytes, is your FPS going to really be okay? I mean, you're going to be using up a lot of GPU core power too in the process, and so you're probably going to find this scenario where you're just lowering settings anyway, remaining under 12 gigabytes of VRAM for that particular game, and then wanting to get more FPS. And so that's my whole crux with this situation right here, is just the value. We go back to the value chart, and the value isn't as good as it is with AMD's own 70 class card this time around. And if we go down memory lane from AMD, the RX 6600 XT versus say the RX 6700 XT, there was a value gap there that was in favor of the RX 6600 XT. And if we go back to say NVIDIA with the, especially the RTX 3060 and 60 Ti class cards versus the 3070, they offered better value than the 70 class card. But it seems like this time around, we've had this hollowing out of this 60 class segment. And it just shows whether we're looking at the street pricing or whether we're looking at the actual MSRPs provided from AMD themselves. And so for me personally, as an enthusiast over the last over 20 years, being in, 25 years at least actually, being in a nerd playing games on PC, I've just noticed that it's kind of, the easiest way to explain this to you guys would be like going to buy ice cream from the store, and then you're getting like ice confectionery now instead of it being actual ice cream. And this was actually a big thing in Australia where the companies started putting less like actual milk and stuff in the ice cream, and you went to the store and you found yourself like, why does this taste different? Why is it like not going off as quick, right? And then why do I feel worse after eating this so-called ice cream? And so there was laws passed in Australia where if you wanted to get, if a company wanted to sell ice cream, they actually had to put a certain amount of ingredients that was reminiscent of what they used to put in actual ice cream. And so that's kind of like how I feel when it comes to buying a 60 class card now. You've been used to getting a certain level of performance, even relative versus the higher end cards in the stack, but now you're getting less. It's like going to the store and yeah, you're like looking for that ice cream, even the budget ice cream, and instead you get nice confectionery. And that's the easiest way for me to sum it up. I don't feel like if I go out and buy a 9060 XT or a 9060, or if I'm going out to NVIDIA and buying a 5060 or a 5060 Ti, I feel like I'm just getting not what I'm used to getting from a 60 class card. And so it really feels like both from NVIDIA and AMD, you're truly getting now this 50 class card that when we look at the power consumption has just been ramped up to the max. And if we look at those clock speeds, you'll notice that they're very aggressive. In fact, this card, as well as the Steel Legend, they went up to 3.4 gigahertz if I tuned them a little bit, which was insanely high. So they do go high in terms of clock speed, but you're really maxing out what you can do on a 128-bit bus. But if we look at the raw numbers in the gaming numbers, it's still just so far behind the 9070 and the 9070 XT. They're different, just whole tiers of cards completely, to the point where the 9070 XT is nearly double the performance of the 9060 XT. So that's kind of like my most disappointing aspect with this card. But now it's time to talk about a recommendation, and that is, it is beating out the value of the 5060 Ti. You can see that in the charts, and even though it's giving it a little bit less performance, it does cost a significant chunk less, especially at retail. So AMD have done a good job of beating NVIDIA. It's just that they've kind of followed the same footsteps as NVIDIA with this 60 class card. That's just how I feel about it. But ultimately, if you're looking for the best value, I would either look at getting a 9070 if you can try and stretch it and get up. I know it's actually quite a significant amount more money. Going up to a 9070 is just going to get you a much better experience on PC. But if you're looking for I guess to play at 1080p, which will come in tomorrow's video, we'll be comparing directly the 5060 Ti versus the 9060 XT at 1080p. If you're looking for that just raw comparison with those numbers and the 1080p numbers, we'll be showing that direct comparison on which should you buy. If you only have this amount of money, you want to buy a new GPU, should you get the 5060 Ti or the 9060 XT? That comparison will be out tomorrow. Though at this stage, my recommendation is with the 9060 XT, I'd try and get it a bit cheaper. I'd try and get it around that $350 price point. I'd like to see it even then a little bit cheaper. I think it should be coming out ultimately with better value, not just with MSRP, but also street prices versus the 9070. Come on, AMD, you got to make that happen for people. Lower the prices or try and get the prices down a bit, because in Australia, the prices are actually pretty decent for the 9060 XT 16GB. I have seen them coming in a significant chunk cheaper than the 9070 as well as the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB. So summing things up for you guys with the 9060 XT 16GB, the traditional review here, I think there's some better value options out there at the moment, both new and especially used. I would like to see it come down a little bit in price, but if you have to buy it, it's not a bad card. It's just not great either. So that's kind of my, really just with this card. That's my feelings. Anyhow, guys, hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button and we'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.